Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great time. This is a quick tutorial on how to create a walk cycle, and if you practice it correctly, you can create your own walking cycle within minutes. For this exercise I'm using a rig called Moom. I will have the link to download it on the description down below. So without much further ado, let's just jump straight into it. To begin with, let's make sure that we can see the controls. Some characters will have their controls hidden, as for example the character we are using for this exercise. Here, to turn the controls visibility on and off, we'll just have to come to the display tab and check the first boxes. That will toggle their visibility, and now we can see the controls again. Quickly make sure that the hands controls are set to forward kinematics and the feet to inverted kinematics. It is a good practice to learn both control types. Take some time to do some research on the difference between those two processes. In this tutorial, we'll be focusing mainly on two key positions for your walking cycle animation, the crossing and the contact. The crossing pose is the moment when one of your legs crosses the other, moving from the back towards the front, and the contact pose is when the moving leg first contacts the ground. The contact generally is done with the heels, except when you want to animate different movements, such as sneaking, when the first contact would be done with the toes instead. When animating, I like to work with the auto key feature turned on. The auto key will key any changes you make to a character automatically, as the name suggests. Make sure that you are in the right place in the timeline before you start making changes to the character, or you might overwrite the work that you have already done. In order to set your first keyframe, you have to do it manually, however. With the control selected, we just need to position the timeline where you want and press S on the keyboard, and we are set. Let's now just start with the first pose, the crossing. Here I'm working from my idea of what a crossing pose should look like, but I highly recommend you to search for some references to help you with the process. While in this pose, the supporting foot is fully flat on the floor, while the moving foot is afloat. You can animate a character part by part or the entire character at once. You work however is easier for you. After my first pose is done, I will move further along the timeline. Nowhere in particular, but try to keep it organized. I like to leave some frames in between my keyframes. Later I use them for my in-betweens. If you don't know what I'm talking about one of the 12 principles of animation. If you want to become an animator, you probably heard of it before. The next pose will be the contact. Again, please consult a reference image to help you get it right if you need it. The contact should happen with the heel. Unlike the crossing pose, here the support foot is partially out of the ground to compensate for the distance between the legs. Use comma and full stop to move between keyframes. It helps you visualize your work. Moving forward, the next pose will be the crossing again. This is easy, we have already done it, but this time we need to mirror the pose. Since the foot crossing this time around will be the other one, you can simply duplicate the first pose and make the changes. This will save you some time posing the character. In order to duplicate a keyframe, select the frame you want to duplicate in the timeline and the controls in which you want to duplicate. In this case, all of them. Then move in the timeline using the middle mouse button. That way you can navigate the timeline without triggering the animation. When you are in the right place, simply key the position by pressing S on the keyboard. Once more, the next contact pose is just a mirror of the previous contact. Let's duplicate it and change it accordingly. Work the minor details and create the in-between animation. Fix the position of the foot on the ground and the head, animate the hip and the shoulders. Take this process to adjust the transition between keyframes for a smoother result. Now that both sides have been posed, let's create a playback loop. For it to work, we need to connect the last pose with the first pose. In other words, the next pose we have to create is technically the very same as the first pose. This can be solved with a simple duplication technique by selecting all the controls, middle mouse click the place on the timeline and pressing S to create a keyframe. Set the timeline to end on one frame before the last keyed pose. In this case, I will set my timeline to end at the frame 20 rather than the frame 21 where my last key is. Since the last and the first pose are the same, the next frame will revert to frame 1, creating an infinite loop. The position of the keyframes in the timeline right now isn't very important, because it can be adapted later. Changing the position of the keys on the timeline will directly affect the speed of your animation. To do that, press Shift and click and drag a selection over the keys you want to modify. Make sure the right controls are selected first. At the end of your selection, you will see an arrow that, if moved, will stretch or compress the selection accordingly. After positioning your keys, before you unselect it, it is always a good practice to right-click on the selection and select Snap to set the keyframes in the right place. That will prevent keyframes to be positioned in between frames. Let us now make sure that the transition between frame 20 and frame 1 can occur smoothly. The best and easiest way is to work through the graph editor. Open Windows, go into Animation Editor and select the graph editor. Dock it if necessary. The graph editor displays all the keyframes and connect them with what we call curves. We can manipulate and tweak the animation through the curves in this graph. By default, the curves are set to auto tangent. This mode allows the animation to flow more naturally by automatically adding a slow in and slow out effect. However, in our animation, this effect should not be applied at the end of the last key, since the last key must flow uninterrupted with the first key. This is the little pause you see just before it loops. To prevent it, just select all your keyframes at the end of it and convert them to linear. Do the same for all the first keyframes too. Now the flow between the frame 20 and frame 1 will be imperceivable. Take some time and become familiar with the graph editor. It saves you a lot of time in your animation. The same rules of move and scale apply here. Selecting keyframes and pressing W on the keyboard allows you to move them by clicking and dragging with the middle mouse button. Selecting multiple keyframes allows you to scale the positioning between them by pressing R and middle mouse clicking and dragging on the graph. Play with them and see how you can improve your animation. Before you commit to render, let us test by creating a playblast. The playblast will create a rough video of your active viewport that is better than a buffered playback, as the buffered playback can be a little skippy at times. To create a playblast, right-click on your timeline, go into Playblast Options. Within the options, change a place to save your playblast, change the settings accordingly, and press Playblast. When you are satisfied and no more adjustments are needed, you are ready to render it.